Hello, everybody. People are coming into the webinar, so we'll give folks a minute or two to get situated. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving holiday and are back for the sprint to the end of the year. Give it another minute or two. Okay. I think we can get started now. I'm sure we'll get some more other folks trickling in. Um, Well, I would like to thank everyone for joining us on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon um, for a what should be an amazing conversation about tutoring and the state of tutoring in the United States. My name is Ivo Popoff. I'm a senior vice president of Whiteboard Advisors. Prior to Whiteboard, I was the chief innovation officer at the New Jersey Department of Education. It's my pleasure to moderate this conversation with, like I said, on a topic that I think is near and dear to the hearts of at least I know the folks on the panel, hopefully all the folks that are joining us today, with a great group of panelists. This report is a follow-on of a uh, report we just published. I'm sorry, this panel is a follow-on of a report we just published. I'm sorry, give me a second so I can pull that up. I'm not sure why it's not there. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Apologies for a technical issue on my end. Um, the report we just published called the State of Tutoring 2025, Tutoring in Transition. Um, this report came out a few weeks ago. It was commissioned by Pearl, and it's what we hope to be the first report in what we hope to be a series of reports every year that sort of chronicles um, the state of tutoring, looking at not just today, and this particularly with this first report, but sort of how we got to where we are today with tutoring and what the future might hold for tutoring. Um, Before jumping in a little bit more on the report, we put this together after, I'd say, dozens of interviews with state leaders, district leaders, researchers, providers, a whole host of different folks that are really knowledgeable when it comes to tutoring. But we also looked at the data from over 1 million tutoring sessions, all anonymized from the Pearl data hub, to really try to get a sense of like what has not just tutoring look like now, but over the past 5 or 6 years, what are some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of things that have been changing or not? Um, Real quick for the panel today, and we have the information on the report on the screen. We'll also drop the report link in the chat for folks. But we got an amazing panel with us today. We have Monica Bott, the University of Chicago Education Lab, Shantae Duggins from the University of Florida Lasting Center for Learning, John Falia, the CEO of Pearl, Kara Hamilton of Guilford County Schools. And before we sort of go into um, sort of opening up the conversation, John, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the state of tutoring today, right? We talk about in the report this idea that um, tutoring is sort of at this crossroads. And I can't even sort of count the number of people that we interviewed during the report who said, this is actually a really important sort of conversation to have, and it's super timely right now. I guess from your perspective, and you're out there talking to states and districts all the time, like, why is that? Why do you think that this is like a particularly timely moment for us to have this conversation around tutoring?
Yes, well, Eva, I want to start by sharing appreciation for putting this all together and for, facilitating this whole report. And it's fascinating with how interested people are in a, niche of education. Because from my opinion, tutoring's always been here. Tutoring was something that was happening long before ESSER. Tutoring was something that happened long before, the United States was even founded. So tutoring's always been around. However, before ESSER, tutoring was somewhat in the shadows of education because oftentimes it fundamentally implied that the teacher wasn't doing a good enough job, so you had to bring in a tutor. So tutoring was always here. It was kind of on the side of education or on the peripheries. But when ESSER came into the space, one, more money was spent on tutoring than probably any other intervention. So that initially is going to bring a lot of attention to it. Two, it's this interesting dichotomy where tutoring works. The evidence is out there and the research is out there to show that tutoring really does work under certain scenarios. But there's, just as many examples during the ESSER period of where tutoring really didn't work and, was a flat out failure. So I think the fact that tutoring has been around forever, that so much money was put into it over these past 4 years to kind of give it its shot, it saw a lot of success in some places and a lot of failures in other places. It just created a somewhat of a mystique or a really big interest around tutoring. When does it work? And is it going to be able to survive these ESSER cliffs that, have hit over the last 6 months?
Yeah, just really quick, just to show folks what we mean. I don't know what's going on with this. Give me 1 second. Uh, if I'm in presentation mode on the slides, it will not come up on share. Sorry about that. Um, but want to give folks an idea of what we mean by this sort of ESSER cliff, real quick. Um, Folks know this, but about $200 billion was infused in U.S. education in 2020. On average, you see what that on the chart on the right here, translate to about a 7% increase. But for districts in particular, high poverty districts that were um, more likely to receive those funds, for some districts that was 20%, 40% bump in terms of the funds that they were receiving. So it really did have an impact. And as you noted, a lot of those dollars were spent on tutoring and other things like that to address and had to, particularly with ESSER 3. But they also spent money on things like staffing and other things, which are becoming a challenge as that funding goes away, and districts are trying to figure out how to manage their budgets right now. They don't want to let go of people. So this sort of challenge right now of we've got less money coming in, we've got all these things that we want to do, creates a budget, challenge for districts. And for many, they're also dealing with declining enrollment at the same time. So I think that is sort of this dynamic that's going on right now. And it's definitely something that, as we talk to folks out there for the report, was a recurring theme of there was this time of ESSER funding where tutoring looked a certain way and people were adopting it a certain way, and it's sort of shifted over time. And now that there's fewer dollars, we're rethinking the way we're thinking about tutoring. We'll get to that with the panel. The other thing that's definitely shifted, and we spotlighted this in a report and talked about this a little bit earlier, is you know, not surprisingly, when the pandemic hit, a lot of kids weren't in school. There was a preponderance of tutoring delivered virtually, and what we have seen through the analysis of the data is this big shift. And this was one of the things that anecdotally, from our qualitative research from the interviews definitely came out. Most people we talked to like we're favoring in person, but definitely played out in the data as well that we saw from the touring sessions over time. There has been this sort of it's flip-flop from obviously at a time when a lot of schools were closed, fewer in person, mostly online, and now those two positions have sort of like it's almost like the inverse of the two graphs. in terms of how that shifted over time. So something we want to explore as well as we talk through what the implications are that moving forward and why that is, and what we might see coming for in the future. I think open question for sort of the whole panel, and I'd love to sort of bring everyone into this. In the report, we talk about how sort of tutoring has evolved, and John mentioned this sort of from this add-on. Schools might have had it as an after-school program. Parents might have been paying for it to this sort of core strategy, particularly during the pandemic, as a way to address academic challenges. Um, so from that time, let's say 2020 to today, how have you seen these programs changing? Like what are folks seeing on the ground and in the states that you work with? I'll open that up but we'll call on someone if no one raises their hand.
I can get us started.
Yeah, go for it, Shante.
Hi, so I'm Shantae Duggins at the University of Florida, and we have the privilege of administering a statewide tutoring program for the first time. We've launched this year statewide in Florida called the Florida Tutoring Advantage. And for us, we know that our districts differ. We know that students, their needs differ within districts. And so we provided our districts with the option of identifying what type of service they wanted to receive. And so it actually landed about 50-50 for us. So we have about half the students that we're serving in Florida who are receiving services virtually, and the other half face to face, as well as a number of students who are receiving services through automated software.
One of the trends I'll share and add on top of Shantae's, because it's one of the things they're doing in Florida, which is really following the research. One of the awesome opportunities ESSER created in education is it allowed for experimentation. There was more money than a lot of districts had seen before, so it allowed them to try a lot of different things when it came to tutoring. A lot of folks tried on-demand and homework help tutoring. That's been around since the year 2000 when tutor.com was created. So that's always been here, but it allowed districts and schools start to test out a lot of different things. What I've seen shift from the beginning of the ESSER era towards, today in this post-ESSER world is that people are no longer willing to experiment or try unproven tutoring models. They're willing to invest in the ones that have been proven and actually have an evidence base behind them now. So Susanna Loeb and her team over at the National Student Support Accelerator has done an amazing job bringing together a lot of this research, and we've started to see more districts and states focus on groups no larger than 4, focus on the same tutor and the same student, like some of those principles that are really important for evidence-based instruction.
I want to go to that. I'll turn to Monica, but before I do that, I always forget to do this. Apologies for our amazing audience that's here and attendees. We want to have questions. We welcome you guys to ask questions. Please use the Q&A feature below. Chat will also work if you want to shoot a question our way. Send it over to us. We'll either, if a question works into the flow of what we're talking about, we'll fold it in. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end to address questions as well. But apologies. Um, so please, we want to hear what your questions are and make sure they get answered. Monica, so John just talked about the evidence base and the research base. In the same way that I couldn't count the number of people who were like, this is super timely. I couldn't count the number of people who were like, this report came out from University of Chicago on Saga's high dosage tutoring model. And that sort of like this perfect storm of pandemic and that report. I loved what you sort of and sort of like this sort of push towards high dosage tutoring for, I'm assuming most of the folks that are joining us know it, but just to sort of, make sure everyone's on the same page. Uh, can you kind of talk through what your research found and sort of talk through sort of this model of high dosage or high impact tutoring?
Sure. So thanks again for putting this together. It is a very timely conversation. I actually think that the nomenclature is very important because when we talk about high dosage tutoring, we're not talking about homework help. And so it's just a vision of tutoring that is very different from like I show up after school, there's a kid there, I read to them, I ask them what they're working on, and I offer some help maybe once a week. That is not at all to say that that is not a great, helpful thing to do, but that is very different from what the evidence base has been around high dosage tutoring. And I think what this movement is, as John mentioned, this is really, I think it's not pedagogically rocket science. It's differentiated instruction and coaching, which we know is sort of like the best way for anyone to learn anything, whether you're trying to learn how to play the piano or learn double digit addition. It really is helpful to have content placed in front of you that is just beyond your ability level, some encouragement and practice and time to practice that skill, and then you master it, and then you move on to the next thing. And that sort of productive struggle where you're actually engaged in practicing that skill that you're trying to learn is where learning happens. The problem is that US schools haven't really been organized around that frame of schooling because we have a sort of system of mass schooling where you say, okay, we're going to have one teacher to 30 students, and you're going to be in kindergarten, you're going to be in first grade. And so the teacher is incentivized to teach at the grade level because that is their job. But if for some reason, you as a kid are like not an automated machine and so don't learn at the exact same rate as your peer on every particular skill, there is a chance that you could like fall behind. So imagine you're a kid in math and you're a couple of grade levels behind at this point in middle school, and you're like, wait a minute, you know what? I'm not getting what the teacher is sharing in the sixth grade math class. That must mean that I'm not good at math. It must mean that I'm not a math person. I'm not good at school. And then I start to tell myself this story that takes me further and further away from my goal. So high dosage tutoring is very, very different from, I think, a different instructional delivery model from the way in which we have been thinking of the task of teaching, which is like one teacher and 30 kids. And instead, it is much more aligned to how people and kids actually learn. It's usually during the school day, although I'm willing to sort of talk about that. I know that can be a controversial statement. It is set aside scheduled time using a structured curriculum that is ideally aligned with the Tier 1 instructional material. There's a good paper by Kara Jackson that just came out about instructionally coherent material. And you have a paid and trained tutor, although also willing to have an asterisk on the train. There's some good evidence around reading partners with volunteer tutors, but a paid and trained tutor who's sort of pushing into the classroom and making that tutoring and coaching available. So like the best version of what this could look like that we studied in Chicago was kids had a math lab class on their schedule every single day, and they just went to that class. There were 6 tutors, 24 kids, and you would see the same tutor every single day, and you would practice math. And then turns out that if you practice math, you learn math. Since then, as John mentioned, there's been a 1,000 flowers that bloom during the ESSER years of investment. And I think just to hop onto the first question you asked, one trend that I'm seeing is that people are really starting to think of high dosage tutoring as part of their instructional strategy for instructional delivery. And that's very different than for those of you who remember the supplemental educational services world.
SES.
15, 20 years ago, whatever, in the past.
Or the
That's a
NCLB,
really different model because that was very much like homework help. And this is really different. We're starting to talk about instructional coherence and how tutors can push into the classroom and be a complement to what teachers are doing. And I think that is exciting because we're starting to think about how to change the instructional delivery model of US schooling, and that's not really a conversation we've had before in policy reform.
Yeah, and I remember when we were chatting for the paper, I loved your quote. You were saying, I think something like you thought you saw high dosage tutoring as sort of one of the best examples of like research informed policy because it literally was, and maybe it was that perfect storm, but the research came down, and it wasn't, if I'm not mistaken, like that was a report that came out of research that you guys have been doing for a few years before that as well too. But like the timing was great, and it became the thing. To John's point, like it became the language that people used when they talked about it. But what I like about your quote is that you said like it probably one of the best examples of research reform policy, but also probably more you know, let's sort of like adhere to specifically in terms of like this sort of gold standard of what high dosage tutoring is. I think Liz Cohen, who wrote a great book on the future of tutoring that just came out, said what we have actually is like a lot of silver, standard models. These asterisks that you talk about. Kara, I'd love to bring you into this conversation because you live this on the ground, right? Like, what have been the challenges as you built out the sort of tutoring program in Guilford, and sort of what are those like those asterisks, and how do you sort of deal with those obstacles that stand in the way of trying to sort of implement what the research says works?
Sure, thank you. I think, well, we've gone through a lot over the last several years, and our program has really shifted. Not just because we're learning from our practices, but also because of funding. That's a big part of it. But I really, from a district perspective and implementation perspective, I'm really seeing this high dosage tutoring shift being, from that emergency response after the pandemic to this more deeply embedded component of daily instruction, like Monica was talking about. Something that's not just layered on top of existing structures, but really built into the way we do school. And that's how we've really viewed it here in Guilford County. We've really tried to strengthen training, provide tutors with curriculum aligned materials, build ongoing coaching support. So we're talking about a lot of really deep, difficult things to just really throw out there and do overnight. Of course, we didn't do it overnight, but I think that these things that we've really focused on have helped the tutor really feel more like part of the instructional team rather than just an outside resource. So I think one of the biggest changes for us was really defining that integration within MTSS, in that school improvement framework, and using a data-driven approach and really aligning tutor-led instruction with grade level core curriculum.
Yeah, I think we heard that from you. We also heard from a few of the other districts and some states that we've talked to where, you know, if step one of sort of bringing tutoring into the mainstream was it's not this after school thing anymore, or this add-on, we're talking about it more as a core thing. The next phase was we're now incorporating it into our MTSS structure. It is an intervention, alongside other interventions. So how do we not just have it to the side as this other thing and really think about it as part of this MTSS structure? Got a question here. Two questions that sort of relate. I'll open it up, but I think Kara, if I'm not mistaken, your program spans elementary and middle school, correct? We had a
Yes.
question. We had two questions. What are some differences of best practice for K-5 versus middle school? I think there was another one around what does the research instruct us with regards to tutoring models and age of children? Um, Open us up to the group. But Kara, maybe from your experience, what are you seeing as sort of those differences? Maybe you can kick off the conversation, and then Monica, Shante, John, if you got, what you're seeing out there as well, as far as how those models might vary but with age groups.
Yeah, I think that tying this back into some of the challenges we've experienced, middle school is difficult to really ensure that students are getting the dosage that the research says is effective. There are all sorts of things going on, and it's, well, how do you build that time into the day? And we've really, worked with principals on you know, how to make that happen. I think in elementary school, it's been easier because there's that built-in small group time. So middle school, we've put a lot of work into a lot of coaching and support plans, but that's continued to be a challenge. Is middle school getting the dosage?
Other folks, Shantae, John, Monica, what are you guys seeing, or what are you seeing as sort of either best practices or what some of those key differences are between, a successful elementary program and a successful middle school program?
Yeah, so I can really only speak to the perspective of the data that we have. So we have states using our systems, districts, and then also private providers. And what I've noticed is that the younger the students are, the more we're seeing push for in-person and shorter sessions, which, surprise, surprise, putting a kindergarten student on a laptop, they can turn their camera off for the first 5 minutes and pretend like the laptop isn't working just so that their tutoring session ends up being 5 minutes shorter. So I can't really speak too much to the pedagogical side of things as much as we've seen the older the students get, the more autonomy they tend to be given. And that comes through the lens of being able to do virtual as opposed to in person. And then also timing of the day. Sometimes high schoolers are a little more responsible in getting on that evening virtual tutoring session versus a second or third grade student.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one thing from the research perspective, which is in elementary school, small group instruction um, is not kind of an oddity, or put differently, small group instruction really is the name of the game already in elementary schools, oftentimes in classrooms. And so it's not unusual to have, students in different groupings or students pulled out for like a little bit of coaching. And that feels very different when you're an older kid. And so I think, again, just practically, what we see is that having a set schedule that's like a class for older kids seems to work better because then kids aren't stigmatized. So if all the sixth graders, all the seventh graders, all the eighth graders are they might be getting different kinds of content, but they're all doing the kinds of tutoring that's helpful, it leads to kids feeling less stigmatized. In early elementary school, again, I think the small group instruction is oftentimes the name of the game, and so it's a little bit more natural. Um, I do think it just makes it harder to study in the following sense, which is in early childhood or early elementary school studies of high dosage tutoring, oftentimes a counterfactual is also small group instruction, and so you might see smaller effect sizes. In middle school and high school, the counterfactual is oftentimes like an elective or even like another hour of whole group instruction. And so it's just something to keep in mind when you're consuming research in these studies, is that you're comparing two different things. And so the model really matters of like what you're comparing it to.
And so I think we're playing this back a little bit. What I'm hearing is from everyone is when it comes to middle school, you kind of have to have some strategies in place for like, how are we going to get these kids? Because we don't have, to your point, like the natural structures in place with self-contained classrooms and some tendency for smaller group instruction already. It's like, what are those strategies to get the kids? How are we going to get them in? How are we going to make sure that sort of factor into the day? And then you get to bell schedule challenges and all sorts of other things that I have to assume become a little bit more of a challenge in middle school and high school than they might be in elementary. Correct? I know, Shantae, if you're seeing anything with the districts you're working with as far as more or less uptake at certain grade levels.
So currently we're providing high impact tutoring to students K through 5.
That's right. Yeah. And we're seeing that actually in a number of states too, where over the last few years, partially, I'm assuming because of budget constraints, they've had to limit and are limiting to, I think in Tennessee it was K through 3 or other sort of ages as well.
Evo, just to sort of chime in there, we actually, in our study, in studies in general, we don't see differences in take up by like grade band necessarily. Because it's as long as the model makes sense for the school and you can get the kids there, you could have high take up at all grade levels. We do see differences in take up by virtual versus in person. So it does seem like virtual programs seem to be able to get like higher dosage for various reasons than the in-person programs oftentimes, at least in our studies.
It's interesting. I'm sorry, I'm going through some of the questions here, making sure, seeing what we have to. There's an interesting question here, and so there's a few questions on data-driven and outcomes-based to contracts. We'll get to those in a second, so I'll put a pin on those. There's a question here which I think ties into, and I'll open this up for the group as well. Sort of this question like sustainability and this funding cliff. Question about how do you think about which students to target? Is it the students that are farthest behind, a bit behind? I think this has become particularly a question for folks where, in the heady days where you have all this money, you can just provide tutoring for as many kids as you can possibly consider. But as budgets get short, you got to make decisions. I know Carrie, you and I talked about this, but maybe you can jump in on this. But for others, what are you seeing as far as like how that is either districts making those decisions, or is it being decided for them, right? Is it, this is the policy of the state or policies that are sort of coming down? So what are you seeing as far as the ways folks are structuring their tutoring programs and deciding which students should receive the services? Carrie, want to jump in with your story?
Sure. Um, I think in our case, when we really defined what that relationship was between tutoring and MTSS, because when we first rolled out tutoring, honestly, it was a little confusing because we were giving guidelines to really target those lower 20th percentile students. And we used Dibbles and MAP in middle school, those lower percentile students. And we never really came out and defined if this was an intervention or how does that work with interventions? Are they to receive tutoring and interventions? So it was a bit confusing at first, but once we defined that relationship, you know, those students that are 20th percentile and below are receiving supplemental support in tier two. And then we have trained our certified tutors in our standard treatment protocol and our intervention resources. So now we have said that they are able to provide those interventions to students, and that's really helped schools increase their capacity to reach the students that really need support. So when we're implementing district-wide, so that's across, I think it's 80 schools that we have right now. Um, and we've really, each school is different and the students are different. So we can't say this is what you're doing. We can't put that blanket out there and say this is what you have to do. We've given some autonomy to the schools to really do what's best for your students. Staffing is different. Not schools may have interventionists or may have an MTSS coordinator, so they may not need that extra capacity. So therefore, they're using their tutors to supplement core instruction and really give that double dose of core. So we've seen different scenarios.
And I think we know that yeah, for some districts, the decision has been made for them in some ways by the state, where the state says, here's tutoring dollars that are available, and those are available for XYZ students who have not performed on the state assessment. Shante, maybe you can
Yeah.
talk through how the model in Florida works.
Yeah, I'll jump in a bit there. So for us in Florida, we're very fortunate that we have legislation that supports high impact tutoring across the state. And so very clearly in the legislation, high impact tutoring is um, defined to support students at a minimum who, by legislation, have a deficiency in reading or mathematics, so they're not yet meeting those grade level expectations. And so when we communicate with districts, we work with them based on our statewide progress monitoring to identify students that would be in most need of support in either reading or mathematics. And we have access to those data from the state to help districts to make that determination. And oftentimes they identify schools that might be most in need. So it really varies in terms of how districts identify the students, but we do have the legislation that provides the guidance. So we know what students are actually eligible to receive services.
Yeah, so I think we've heard a little bit from how districts are coming at it. And like we said, in some places it's tied to dollars, and those dollars have some rules around it. I guess John and Monica, what do you, as you're sort of working with folks out there, how are they making those decisions? Like what do you hear is like the considerations that they're looking at as they're trying to figure out who to serve?
Yeah, for the conversations we've had with district partners, it comes down to two different themes. One of them's the ideal versus real. So one of it's the like, yes, all of these students are below this threshold, meaning we need to are supposed to give them support, but realistically, these are the resources that we have that can actually meet or provide that support, which is requiring them to take a group of, 1,000 students below a certain threshold and say, hey, we're going to give tutoring to these 500 because those are the ones that we can really only afford to provide it to. What we're also seeing in a number of our district conversations is the theme of we've been doing tutoring, we know it works, we don't have enough money to pay the vendors, so we're going to figure out how to do this in-house. And when they take that approach, it tends to be more of what are the local resources or talents they have? Do they have extra folks with math backgrounds, reading backgrounds? Do they have a university, a couple blocks over where they can start to recruit folks into the schools to serve as tutors? So those are really the two ways we've seen them with lesser ESSER dollars figure out, okay, can we still do this? Who can we provide it to? And how can we do it?
Yeah, in addition to what John was saying, so a lot of the districts that we partnered with for the personalized learning initiative use data to target particular schools and then students that could benefit from the resources most within those schools. The one thing I will say is that from like a research and heterogeneity standpoint, it does seem like tutoring overall seems to be equally effective for kids at all ends of the distribution. So, which is actually kind of rare. Like sometimes you might think that it would be really helpful for kids in the middle of the distribution at baseline, or kids who are really high performers. And what it actually seems to be is that from a treatment effect perspective, it is helpful for all kids, kind of an equal measure. Again, maybe just because it's a pedagogically sound way to teach anyone anything. And the question of how to distribute very scarce resources is oftentimes a values-based judgment that districts are using data to inform, but then there are other considerations put into the mix. And the last thing that I will say is that this honestly was a big premise for the personalized learning initiative, where we had some higher cost models, we had some lower cost models, and we were trying to see if there were some kids who benefited from the lower cost models just as well as kids from the higher cost models, then you could try to figure out which kids really needed the more intensive versions of tutoring and which kids would actually be okay with the lower cost versions, and you could optimize your resources to get the most learning. And that's something that we're actively working on, so stay tuned. But this issue of cost is like obviously a very key one. And I think maybe the one heartening thing for the district and state policymakers on the call and the webinar is that in our study, we found that the lower cost versions seem to be equally effective as the higher cost resource intensive versions overall on average. And that's really good news if we are going to sort of sustain this, because it means that we have figured out a way to merge current assets or technology with this sort of tutoring pedagogical approach. And as long as we're thinking along the lines of that individualized instruction, we seem to be able to make advances to get there at lower cost and retain effectiveness. So that's good news.
That is good news. And I think, to the sort of the questionnaire specifics, or like, are more folks focusing on students who are very far behind, or maybe kids who are a little far behind. I think it's your point. That's probably more of a value judgment decision for the district. I don't know, kind of, I don't mean to lead the witnesses on this, but like one of the things that we did find from this conversation is there's not really big, massive data sets that give really useful, like meaningful information around like who are the students receiving tutoring across, generally speaking. So I don't know if any of the folks on the panel right now are even anecdotal on that. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to say, what are we seeing out there? My guess is it varies somewhat from districts to districts. Within the guidance, to your point, Shantae, there's guidance from the states, but there's still a lot of wiggle room within that guidance around, to John's point, there's 1,000 kids that might qualify. We still got to narrow that down to figure out who receives the benefits here. So I don't know if there's a really good answer on that, which gets us to this question about data. I guess one of the things that we heard, was, we had all this money come in, schools were closed, we had to stand something up. We did something virtual. Consequently, some of it initially was just homework help. Like we didn't know what tutoring was, and eventually settled into some tutoring programs. But in that rush of sort of putting things together, one of the things that wasn't really sort of considered entirely was what's the data that we're going to be collecting on this. And we did hear from some folks who've had systems in place for a while who are now in the process of like putting some data systems in place. Um, Shantae, like you guys are standing this up in real time. This is over like the last year or so, and I know that you've had, let's say, the benefit of seeing what's happened before, and really are building this data piece into it from the outset. So I'd love to sort of talk about like how you're viewing the role of data within uh, the sort of um, broader concept of the program you guys are putting in place.
Yeah, so we do have the benefit of hindsight, but it's still not without some
Yeah.
challenges, I will say. But because we intend to really evaluate the effectiveness of the program in its totality, we want to determine, what works for whom, under what conditions, and at what cost, right? Back to what we were saying before. And really focusing on improving outcomes for students in both reading and mathematics. So we knew right from the very beginning that we needed to have the infrastructure set up to receive data. And when I say data, that includes data from the Florida Department of Education. We have a great partnership with them. And so we know what students are eligible based on their statewide progress monitoring scores. We also can measure impact based on those scores as well. We also receive data from our partners, our vendor providers who are providing tutoring, as well as districts who may be providing tutoring. We work closely with our tutoring management systems to collect the data from a number of vendors and districts, just to make it easy for us and to aggregate all the pieces. But you, for example, we needed to set up a data template. So we had a version 1 where we launched for our pilot. John is nodding because there were some hiccups, right? We've been able to go back and revamp it. And so I think we're in a better place today. We have certain data fields that are mandatory, others that are preferred. Again, we recognize that we're working with a number of our providers for the very first time. So about a third of them, they're working with us for the very first time. And so there are some hiccups in the system. So we intend to receive data more regularly, but we know that we have to work with our districts and our providers to create those processes so they're automated, and that is our goal. But again, back to where we started, we know that we have to have the data infrastructure in place for us to think about, is this working? How is this working? Who is this working for? What does this look like in terms of ROI? And so we've been able to work very closely with a number of our partners as well as other states, and just learning from best practice in terms of the pieces that we need to have ready, and also the things that we need to be willing to revamp. And so we've had some of those conversations internally as well. And we're still continuing to revise and to be better because we want to improve over time. So that's where we are now. So hopefully, we have set ourselves up to do some really robust analysis in terms of looking at all of the different modalities and looking at the different profiles of students that we get to work with across the state.
Well, I won't put you guys on the spot further on what those hiccups were, but Annalie had no qualms about putting Kara on the spot, about asking Kara to talk more about the data driven approach that you guys took. Hopefully this like kind of dovetails a little bit around like what some of these challenges are, and but sort of like what were the challenges and benefits to the approach. I think what have you seen on the ground as sort of like the challenges? And John, you work with thousands of districts around this too, so maybe you can piggyback after Karen what you're seeing as sort of these challenges on the data side.
Yeah, our data collection evolution over the last several years has really refined itself, but our and really the tutor management system that we use in our collection practices, they've really been a game changer. We knew it was important to have this data, but having consistent, high quality data across schools, across tutors, grade bands, it's really allowed us to see the bigger picture, not just what's happening in one school or with one group of students, but really looking at trends that emerge across whole zones or across K-3 literacy or 6-8 math, those focus areas. we're really able to spot where things are working well and where extra support might be needed. And we take all of the data that we collect, and we have a wonderful accountability and research department and data analytics department that are probably tired of working with us by now, but they take all of this data and feed it into Power BI. So we at any time can go in and pull up dashboards and see live data on any tutor, any student, any school, any zone, or district wide. So that's really been a game changer for us.
John, what are you seeing as the challenges around this?
Yeah, well, first off, definitely want to double tap on Guilford's data team because they're some truly amazing folks. And Jimmy, it's what they've been able to do with the work Kara and her team's put in place has really been amazing. So related to what we've seen, one of the unique things we saw with Florida was actually their focus on infrastructure ahead of the program, where they knew they had to address infrastructure for this specific type of program we're running. Because at the end of the day, the tutoring data issue comes to the concept of a square peg in a round hole. Because tutoring wasn't this big before ESSER, there weren't really systems purpose built to track tutoring data specifically. So at the district level, even before learning how to track this new data around tutoring data, they had to look across their system and see what data do we currently have that's relevant for us to help inform or help design our tutoring program. So the first data problem we see a lot of times is the gathering of data across these different systems or different silos within the district. Then the next aspect becomes generating this entire new body of data, which is tutoring data. And what, I'm sure Monica and a lot of the folks here would appreciate and acknowledge is that just tracking attendance for tutoring isn't really enough. You need to get down to the dosage level. The dosage level means minutes. You look at all these other educational tools, they're tracking binary yes, no attendance because that's how it's done elsewhere, but tutoring needs minutes. So the districts first struggled with gathering all this data, then figuring out how can we generate this specific type of data that the researchers need to really see what's working. So the combination of those two is what's created not just that initial data problem, but then that ongoing one if they're continuing to try to solve it via square peg round hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead, Monica.
oh, I was
Sorry.
just gonna jump in here to be like very prescriptive. So couldn't agree with everything John is saying. And one thing that is very hard for us to solve is like the data entry problem, which is that's training and culture around data. But I will be very prescriptive and say, regardless of whether you're doing a study or not, these are like the three pieces of data that I would make sure that you collect. One is who is supposed to get tutoring? And so this is kind of the conversation we had before. Is it all tier two students? Is it all tier three students? And you kind of want that as your denominator because then you can say, of the kids of our sort of value target audience, here's the percentage that are getting tutoring or assigned to tutoring. So these are the kids that are supposed to be getting tutoring. Of those, who is actually getting tutoring, like even once? And that would be like the take up rate. And then of the kids who are getting any tutoring, how much are they getting? And this is the dosage to John's point. And if you can collect those three pieces of information consistently and accurately, that's like 90% of the sweat equity that you need because then attaching outcomes to that is actually quite easy. And you can figure out how to do a study or whatever. But like anybody that you want to work with to try to figure out what's going on, I think to Kara's point, like that just gets you so much of the way there because then you can troubleshoot on the ground. So, for example, in the personalized learning initiative, we had school level reports, district level reports that came out monthly that you could monitor um, this exact sort of series of information on. I know with Pearl you can do that in real time, and so that's even better. You don't need people like me doing it, but those are the three pieces of information. Honestly, for any program that you're running, that I would suggest that you collect.
So I think if we're saying, you looking to the future a little bit here, this is an area we'd love more, whether it's states or districts that are putting these programs in place and saying we're going to put dollars towards this to follow the lead of Florida. and upfront sort of put these things in place and make sure that data is part of the program, right? Almost as important as what's actually happening is collecting the data. And I know a few folks talk about, like, if we're going to sustain this, part of it also means making the case in the future that this, like, the minutes are happening, the dosages are happening, the kids that we say are supposed to be receiving the tutoring are receiving the tutoring, and that's part of what we need to build here. I will also direct folks to the paper and the great forward by Scott Murray, who was the superintendent in Ector County in Texas, um, where he specifically talks about the benefit. You know, they're one of these folks that rolled out tutoring because of where they are, they had to do virtual. And he said the real benefit of virtual is they had all this data. Like, the data collection piece wasn't the challenge. And he really does talk about this journey that they went on around this continuous improvement process, that where the data was the thing that was driving their decisions around how do we improve our system. So I think I would direct folks there to sort of get a little bit more around sort of how folks have you know, other folks, Kara and other districts have approached this, but approach this also with virtual tutoring. We've talked a lot about in person, but there are folks that have had success out there with virtual. Also want to point out that I don't want to put words in Scott's mouth, but they then were able to launch and roll out outcomes-based contracting as part of this as well. We have a contract. We have a question here around sort of what the pros and cons are of those, or have we, like, is there consensus yet on whether that's working? Is that sort of the trend of the future? I don't know if folks here have an opinion on that.
So we are currently utilizing principles of OBC, and we are moving towards fully adopting OBC. I mean, it makes sense, right? If at the end of the day we are focused on improving student outcome, then we need to have some shared accountability with the folks that are providing services to students to that end. So it makes sense to us in Florida, and we are moving towards adopting fully OBC contracts and thinking about how we move the needle for students in reading and mathematics. So that's on the forefront for us.
Where Shantae, I loved how you just put it around OBC principles, because that feels like the absolute correct way to start. If you try to go full OBC structured contract with vendors and everyone day one in your district, we've seen a lot of partners just struggle with get it off the ground and hold up the district's end of the bargain, because the whole thing with OBCs is like the vendors are going to be based on this, but the district is, promising they will do X, Y, and Z. So doing a slow rollout with it, I think, is the absolute correct way. And one tidbit I'll share from our experience this week, we met with a district who now has a strategic directive, a strategic KPI to launch 8 OBC contracts across the district next year, not just in tutoring. So foundationally, like, who doesn't agree with the concept of an OBC? I'm going to pay you money, give me outcomes, especially when you think about this being taxpayer dollars to pay money to get outcomes. But I think this will also appear similarly to the silver standard, where there's going to be a tier below true OBC that still includes X, Y, and Z, and still achieving the spirit of the partnership or the spirit of the agreement.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I know we interviewed some folks around this for the paper as well, is folks will often think outcomes-based contracting puts a lot of onus on the vendor. It actually almost puts almost more on the district. Like, the district needs to have their sort of ducks in a row first, or you will have vendors say, no, like, we're not going to enter this agreement with you if we don't feel like you have the data systems in place to even, let us know whether the tutors, if they're your tutors, are going to be, there or not. So I think we're still seeing this evolving. This is sort of a growing trend. As you guys talked about it, like, this is something that we're in the midst of, so we'll see where it goes. But I definitely think that there's a logic to it, and we'll see if see how it takes shape in the coming years. We got a few questions that are open there, but I asked everyone this sort of as part of the paper, but, like, if we had this panel again in 5 years, what's different? Is virtual tutoring gone? Is tutoring gone? Has it become something else? Like, what are your thoughts, like, on what the future of tutoring holds? Maybe one thought from each of you, and I think maybe I can squeeze in one or two other questions from the audience. I will start with Monica.
I think I've said this, but to me, when high dosage tutoring started it up, it really, because of the ESSER dollars, I like saw this phenomenon where it would be part of like the strategic projects, um, division in a district. And I've sort of seen it migrate slowly over to teaching and learning. And to me, that's a really positive move. Because to me, this is a reform movement around instructional delivery. And that does feel very different than reform movements based on curricular changes. So I know HQIM is like very big. So it's not, I'm not saying you need only one and not the other, but having great curricular materials without this change in instructional delivery also seems partial. And so I think if we were doing this in 5 years, I hope virtual tutoring does not go away because it seems to be very effective. I hope we figured out some sustainable models for funding. And there's some policy changes that we could talk about. But I hope that it's actually just far more integrated into teaching and learning departments, and MTSS structures is just a way to deliver instruction to kids in a school day. So.
Kara, you're next to my screen.
I agree with everything Monica just said. I think that we'll see the districts that keep it going, I think will be the ones that fully blend it into their instructional systems instead of treating it like a separate program, like Monica said.
Shantae.
Ditto, and I will add that tutoring provides, I think, a really outstanding opportunity for us to think about the teacher pipeline. So I know we're seeing on a very small scale here in Florida, again, because we're just getting started this year, but we have pockets, we have districts where pairs are providing tutoring. We have high school students that are being trained to provide tutoring. And so I do see tutoring as an opportunity to just increase the teacher pipeline and to think about how we get some more capacity to support students who need it most. But tutoring hopefully doesn't go away, and we have the funding to sustain it for the students who need it. And our data systems are in place, and so we can measure impact and continuously improve.
I'm glad you brought that point up. I don't remember who was for the paper when we talked to. They said they see sort of this world sort of going to two places, like the districts that are very focused on tutoring as a strategy for academic outcomes, and the place that yes, we're doing that also, but it's also a strategy for teacher pipeline, and those will look different in terms of how they become implemented in the districts because there's slightly different goals that you're looking for there. John and other folks jumping on this. Can't go a full hour in 2025 without talking about AI. So I'm going to ask your question, the same question, but role of AI. I know, Shante, you guys are looking at AI as some of the work you guys are doing there too, but like, where do you see AI sort of factoring in here? What are you guys doing around it?
Yes, can't have a conversation without AI. We are very much focused right now on leveraging AI to enhance relationships between administrators, tutors, parents, and students, as opposed to replace anyone in our cycle. So I know initially the big push on AI at first was great news. We don't need teachers. Every student can have a personalized study buddy. I'm very excited to start to see that trend start to move away from it. But I believe tutoring and AI combined can provide the actually most effective and efficient form of personalized learning for students. So, as we think 5 years from now, I see tutoring as a portion of a district that has different types of models or different forms of delivery, whether it be virtual, in person, AI, near peer, whatever that model is. And based on that student, they're able to find the right model or the right form that'll help them achieve the outcomes or whatever they're trying to get to, but not necessarily have a one size fits all for students in 5 years from now.
Anyone else got thoughts on the AI piece of this? It's required. I'm obligated to ask a question about it. Apologies for that, but it is the times that we live in.
If I may add just
Yeah.
one quick note. So here in Florida, we're working with Conmigo to provide AI enhanced support for students in 6 through 12. And along with that, there's a suite of resources to educators because we know that teaching is challenging, but there's some things that AI can be used for that'll make things a bit easier for teachers. And so whether that's, lesson planning or aligning assessments to standards, so I do see that there's a role for not only supporting students, but also supporting educators.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we heard from a lot of folks was the initial place where AI can probably help is helping teachers. And then on some of the other pieces, whether it's helping, the teachers and the tutors, or for providing additional feedback for the tutors on, what they can do better potentially, or other things like that. Which I think is good. I think to your point, John, this idea of AI as a tool rather than as the tutor itself, I think we've moved away from that idea. We could probably go on for another half hour. We don't have another half hour. I think the future of tutoring looks bright based on the fact that there's still questions rolling in and we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. So apologies. We tried to answer as many of the questions as they were coming up as part of this. Thank you all for attending, but thank you panelists for taking time out today to talk about this topic, sharing your wisdom and insights. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights for the paper as well. Really appreciated all the time you gave us as we're putting the report together again. Great topic. Really looking forward to continuing the conversation in the future and really seeing where tutoring goes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.